Miss Marple and the mystery of the ancient gallery. Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Warm Chapters. My name is Thomas, and I'm so glad to share this peaceful time with you. Now get comfortable and let us begin. Chapter 1. An evening walk along the long stone gallery. The village of Langley St Edmund had the sort of beauty that seemed not merely natural but established, settled into place by long habit, as though generations of sensible people had quietly agreed that it should remain precisely as it was. September became it particularly well. The warmth of summer had not altogether vanished, but had gentled into something more delicate. The light no longer blazed, but stretched itself in long amber bands over the old stone houses and across the square, touching each familiar surface with a softness that made even the most ordinary corners seem faintly significant. The lane that curved past the post office and churchyard was bordered by elm trees just beginning to turn, their leaves showing here and there the first tentative yellow of autumn's advance. Garden walls wore late roses in dusky pink clusters, clinging, as late roses always do, to the season they are unwilling to surrender. The square itself, with its silent stone fountain at the centre, had the air of a place entirely content with its own continuity. The fountain had ceased to function some years earlier, but this had not diminished its usefulness. Villagers still gathered about it with baskets, dogs and parcels, exchanging the mildly repetitive, infinitely revealing remarks from which village life is largely composed. At the far end of the square stood Langley Hall, withdrawn slightly behind a low iron gate and a stretch of gravel bordered by clipped yew. It had belonged for centuries to the Langley family, at least in name, for the family itself had long since thinned, wandered, married elsewhere, or died out in directions too obscure for local memory to follow with much certainty. The house remained, and the eastern wing in particular had found a second life as a small museum, maintained by the local historical society with county support and the conscientious devotion of several people who cared deeply for old things, especially when accompanied by labels. The hall's principal attraction was the long stone gallery, so called with an honesty one could not but respect. It was long, and it was stone, and it contained a good many things that had once belonged to people now reduced to varnished faces, brittle correspondence, and entries in ledgers. Portraits lined the walls in successive generations of dignity, heavy dark canvases from earlier centuries in which gentlemen stared sternly through powdered wigs, and ladies sat among draperies with resigned grandeur. Later likenesses softened by landscape backgrounds and more relaxed poses, though not, Miss Marple reflected, by any great increase in moral charm. Between them stood cabinets containing silver, maps, estate papers, family letters, account books, and a number of smaller possessions whose importance had survived chiefly because someone had thoughtfully typed it onto a card. Along the inner side ran a tiled corridor leading toward the main hall and to a spiral staircase that rose to an upper balcony. There, beneath arched windows, additional display cases stood in the filtered light, and one had the pleasing sensation, common in old houses, that the building had not entirely forgotten the people who had once moved through it with different intentions. Miss Marple had come to Langley St Edmund on the 1st of September at the invitation of her old friend Mrs. Beatrice Howell, who lived in a comfortable and well-run house beyond the churchyard lane. Mrs. Howell had been urging the visit for some time, and once Miss Marple arrived, she found herself receiving the kind of intelligent domestic hospitality that makes one instantly understand why some households are restful and others exhausting. Mrs. Howell, cheerful, practical, and admirably organised, knew the village in that complete and affectionate way possessed by those who have watched its marriages, deaths, illnesses, quarrels, renovations, and disappointments over many years, and have not, on the whole, found it lacking. She had put dahlias from her garden in the guest room, laid out fresh towels with military exactness, and placed upon the writing desk a small printed leaflet about the museum, in case Miss Marple should wish to spend an agreeable afternoon there. Miss Marple had done rather more than that. In the course of her fortnight's stay, she had visited the hall several times, read the cards, examined the portraits, spoken to the volunteers, and in her usual gentle way absorbed a good deal more than anyone would naturally suppose. The curator, Mrs. Clara Denby, was a woman in her middle 40s, slim, darkly dressed, and possessed of that valuable quality which combines efficiency with restraint. She answered questions carefully, never hastily, as though she consulted some private internal index before speaking. There was nothing overtly secretive about her, but there was caution. She knew her collection thoroughly, managed staff and volunteers with quiet authority, and gave the impression of someone who had invested a considerable amount of herself into the hall and would not welcome interference, though she was far too well-mannered ever to phrase the sentiment crudely. Mr. Gregory Hale, one of the volunteers, was of an entirely different order, a large, solid village man of about 60, with a broad face and neatly flattened silver hair. He possessed the practised steadiness of someone long accustomed to committees, church fetes, public subscriptions, and local respectability. He conducted visitors through the exhibits in a measured, competent voice, and was plainly one of those men whose opinions travel ahead of them and are received favourably before they are even expressed. There was nothing especially unusual about him, except perhaps that he appeared, like many village figures of standing, to know precisely how he ought to appear, and had settled into it so completely that one wondered what might happen if ever he was surprised. It was on the evening of the 15th of September that Mrs. Denby arranged a small private tour of the gallery. The hall was not generally open at night, but an exception had been made because of the presence in the village of Dr. Adrian Wells, a visiting historian connected with one of the older universities, who had requested access to materials relating to the Langley archives. Mrs. Denby had extended the occasion slightly by inviting several interested parties, among them Mrs. Howell and Miss Marple. Dr. Wells turned out to be a man of about 50, spare, angular, and somewhat abstracted, with round spectacles and the absorbed air of a person whose thoughts are never entirely where his body happens to be. He carried a leather satchel and notebook. He was perfectly civil when spoken to, but it was obvious from the start that social exchange was, for him, merely the narrow bridge one crossed on the way to documents. His attention belonged to the past, and more particularly to whatever portion of the past he had come to uncover in Langley Hall. Miss Marple, who rarely considered any new acquaintance too trivial to observe, watched him with mild interest. Very soon she saw that his movements about the gallery were not random. He paused at some objects only briefly, glanced at others, but returned more than once to the eastern end, where a set of framed documents hung beside a cabinet containing bound estate ledgers. The label explained, in that measured tone museums prefer for old domestic scandals, that the documents concerned an inheritance dispute within the Langley family in the late 19th century. The matter, the card stated, had been resolved, and the estate had subsequently passed to the senior male line. It was a discreet description. Too discreet, perhaps. Dr. Wells spent his longest time before a particular ledger from the 1880s, bending over the glass with such concentration that even the most indifferent observer would have known he was not merely confirming a date. He was searching for something, and, Miss Marple thought, had either found it or come very near to doing so. There is a marked distinction between the concentration of a man engaged in routine scholarly duty and that of one who has unexpectedly encountered something that alters the shape of a matter. Dr. Wells had the latter look. At one point Mrs. Denby came quietly to Miss Marple's side and remarked, in a low conversational voice, that Dr. Wells was evidently a very thorough researcher. Miss Marple agreed that he appeared to be, and added that village histories often had a way of lingering in unexpected places long after people supposed them settled. Mrs. Denby gave her a brief glance, one of those small glances which mean more than an entire sentence, and then smiled and moved away. The evening wore on, lamps softened the stone walls, and the last daylight faded from the high windows until the portraits seemed to withdraw further into themselves. At about 8 o'clock, Mrs. Denby began gently steering the party toward departure, Yet Dr. Wells remained at the document case until the latest possible moment, making notes in his small book with a rapid, controlled urgency that did not suit the otherwise composed scholar. When at last he closed the notebook and slipped it into his satchel, he paused and looked once more at the display. Miss Marple, who happened to be standing some distance away while accepting her coat, noticed the expression. It was not satisfaction exactly, nor was it excitement in any simple sense. It was something narrower and more dangerous. The concentrated look of a person who has discovered not merely an interesting fact, but something with consequences. It was the face of someone already considering the uses of knowledge. She said nothing of this to Mrs. Howell on the walk home. There was, after all, nothing definite to say. The night air had turned cool, carrying a faint trace of wood smoke from somewhere along the lane. Stars shone above the dark elm branches with that sharp, reliable clearness which September sometimes grants before the weather fully breaks. Mrs. Howell spoke approvingly of one portrait in particular, and Miss Marple agreed that the evening had been most agreeable. But in her own mind she was still thinking of Dr. Wells's face when he looked back at the ledger, and she reflected, as she had reflected many times before, that agreeable evenings are sometimes only agreeable because they occur just before something dreadful. Chapter 2. A Scholar Found in the Tiled Passage. There is a special stillness to an English village in September morning. Not silence exactly, but a kind of poised quiet in which each sound takes on a separate life. A latch lifted, a cart rolling faintly in the lane, the clink of a spoon against a cup in some unseen kitchen. All these travel distinctly through the cool air, and because of that news travels distinctly too. Mrs. Howell's house kept excellent mornings. Breakfast was punctual, the kitchen warm, the toast properly made and held in an old wire rack, the marmalade of the homemade variety whose bitterness still respected the intelligence of the eater. Miss Marple, who admired good management wherever she found it, had come to appreciate the household's order not merely as comfort, but as a civilizing principle. It was during breakfast on the morning after the evening tour that Mrs. Howell mentioned, with that controlled tone villagers adopt when relaying alarming information before the full extent of it is known, that there had been some sort of incident at the hall. She'd seen the postman at the gate. He had heard, in the efficient and unverifiable manner by which postmen hear such things, that Dr. Wells had been found early that morning in the corridor beside the gallery, and that the doctor had been sent for. Miss Marple put down her teacup and asked in a mild voice whether anything more had been said. Nothing definite, Mrs. Howell replied, only that it was serious, and as it turned out was merely the village's first cautious approach to the truth. Dr. Vincent Marsh, the local practitioner, had been summoned shortly before 8 o'clock. He had served Langley, St. Edmund and the surrounding district for some 25 years, and had the steady, untheatrical authority common to good country doctors, men who have attended births, fevers, accidents, private griefs, and family evasions long enough to acquire not only experience, but patience with human nature. He examined Dr. Wells where he had been found, and gave the preliminary opinion that the man had suffered some sudden collapse. The word was repeated several times over the next few hours. Collapse. It passed from mouth to mouth, useful because it seemed to say something while committing itself to very little. It was not yet suspicious. It was not yet innocent. It was a word with a room inside it, and in that room speculation began to take shape. By 10 o'clock Miss Marple was at the hall. Mrs. Howell had accompanied her, carrying a covered dish, one of those domestic offerings which are seldom eaten immediately, yet are never without value. Clara Denby received them in the small sitting-room adjoining her office, a pleasant chamber with windows overlooking the kitchen garden, where the late vegetables remained in orderly rows under the pale morning sky. The room itself was composed. Mrs. Denby was composed also, but only in the sense that something recently shaken had been set upright again. She thanked Mrs. Howell for the dish and acknowledged Miss Marple's sympathy with grave politeness. The police, she said, had been informed, and there was no definite indication of wrongdoing, but in the event of a sudden death under such circumstances, it was proper that matters should be reviewed. An inspector from Brentwood was expected by mid-morning. Miss Marple agreed that it was entirely right to proceed with care. Then, in the soft and apparently peripheral way that concealed more inquiry than most direct questioning, she asked whether Dr. Wells had still been in the building when the evening's guests left. Mrs. Denby paused before replying, just as she always did. Yes, she believed so. Dr. Wells had asked permission to remain a little longer and consult certain materials more closely. As he was a serious researcher and had written in advance, she had allowed it. He had been given a key to the side entrance with the understanding that he would let himself out and return the key the next day. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. Then she asked whether anyone else had remained in the hall after the main party dispersed. Mr. Hale had still been somewhere in the building, Mrs. Denby said. He usually assisted with closing procedures and ensuring the cabinets were secure. She believed he had left around the same time as the others, though she had not observed his exact departure herself. There followed one of those small pauses in conversation, in which every person present is thinking, rather more than social ease permits them to say. Miss Marple then remarked that, if it would not be inconvenient, she might like to look once more at the gallery. Not at the corridor, she added immediately, unless she seem intrusive, but only at the exhibits she had not fully examined the evening before. Mrs. Denby assented without hesitation and offered to accompany her, but Miss Marple declined with thanks, saying she knew the gallery very well by now and would be perfectly content alone. The room looked quite different by daylight. What had appeared warm and shadowed under evening lamps now stood revealed in cooler tones. The stone walls were paler, the surfaces sharper, the portraits less romantic and more watchful. Morning light lay against the cabinets in long, grey reflections, and the arched windows admitted a clarity that showed every angle and object, with almost too much honesty. Miss Marple proceeded slowly, pausing here and there with all the air of an elderly lady revisiting agreeable details. She read labels. She examined a pair of silver candlesticks. She stood before an early portrait long enough that anyone observing her would have concluded she was merely indulging a tasteful curiosity. Then she reached the eastern end of the gallery. There were the framed inheritance papers upon the wall. There was the locked cabinet containing the ledgers. Above them hung the dark portrait of a prosperous Victorian gentleman with a heavy watch chain and the settled self-satisfaction of one who had never imagined posterity might one day question the arrangements from which he benefited. And beside the case stood the reading table. The previous evening it had held several loose pages and a neat stack of papers that Dr. Wells had evidently been consulting. Miss Marple remembered them distinctly, because they had lain within his reach as he bent over the display, and because a person who is attentive to rooms is attentive also to the temporary disorder that scholars make when at work. Now the table was bare, not simply tidied, not arranged, bare, the sort of bareness that suggests not the natural conclusion of the use, but removal. Miss Marple stood there for a little while. She was not a woman who rushed to dramatic conclusions. Experience had taught her that single details often admit a dozen explanations, and that innocence frequently looks untidy, while wrongdoing can appear almost offensively neat. It was perfectly possible that the papers had been collected for safekeeping. Quite likely indeed. Some conscientious person might have thought it respectful, efficient, or necessary. Mrs. Denby herself might have done it. A volunteer might have done it. One could construct half a dozen harmless reasons with no difficulty at all, and yet the fact remained that a man had spent the evening examining documents connected to an old inheritance dispute. He had shown every sign of having discovered something of unusual importance. He had been found dead in the corridor adjoining that very place, and the papers he had been consulting were no longer there. The combination was uncomfortable. Miss Marple turned away at last and retraced her steps through the gallery with the same measured leisure. She returned to the sitting room, where tea had been brought, and for some time the three women spoke in that restrained, companionable manner peculiar to English households under strain, grief diluted by practical topics. Practical topics interrupted by mild social observations, each speaker instinctively circling the central fact without quite settling upon it. At length, as she was leaving, Miss Marple asked Mrs. Denby, almost as if the thought had only just occurred to her, whether anyone had cleared the reading table near the eastern display. For a moment Mrs. Denby didn't answer. Her face became still in a way that was perhaps more revealing than surprise. Then she said that she had not instructed anyone to move anything from the table, and so far as she knew, none of the staff had touched it. Miss Marple thanked her lightly and said it was probably of no consequence. But when she and Mrs. Howell stepped out through the kitchen garden gate into the lane, with the elm leaves faintly yellow above them, and the village looking as peaceable as ever it had, and no, Miss Marple was no longer thinking about a collapse. She was thinking about removal, and in her experience, when something vanished immediately after a discovery, it was seldom the vanished thing alone that mattered. Much more often, it was the reason someone had wanted it gone. Chapter 3. A crimson ribbon snagged on a bronze frame. Inspector Cowell arrived from Brentwood at 11 o'clock, by which time Langley St. Edmund had already done what English villages invariably do in the presence of sudden death. It had formed an opinion, distrusted it, amended it twice, and begun quietly comparing it with the opinions of others. The process had taken place with outward restraint and inward efficiency. News had passed through the square, along the lane, into kitchens, over hedges, behind shop counters, and back again, gathering shape without ever seeming to be openly discussed. Inspector Cowell was a neat, compact man of about 40, with close-cropped hair and the brisk, carefully managed energy of someone long accustomed to inconvenient events and determined not to let them consume more time than necessary. He moved through the hall with competence, spoke courteously, wrote things down, and gave the general impression of a man who valued order in all forms, including the arrangement of facts. Miss Marple, observing him from a discreet distance, was reminded of a solicitor's clerk she had once known in St. Mary Mead, a young man of exemplary efficiency, who had on one memorable occasion completed a full set of documents with great speed and faultless handwriting before anyone had quite established what the documents ought to say. Efficiency, Miss Marple had long thought, was an admirable quality, but one which benefited greatly from being married to patience. The union was not always a happy one. The inspector spoke at length with Mrs. Denby in the curator's office, then with Dr. Marsh, and later with Mr. Gregory Hale, who had appeared at the hall in the late morning wearing the air of a conscientious local man, uncertain whether he ought to present himself, yet even more uncertain whether absence might later be judged unfavourably. Inspector Cowell accepted each account with professional calm, writing steadily in his notebook, his expression one of method rather than speculation. Miss Marple had not remained away from the hall for long. She had spent the earlier part of the day at Mrs. Howell's house, attempting a letter to her niece with less success than usual, her mind being occupied by matters that had arisen during her morning visit and which required, she felt, a certain internal arrangement before they could be profitably considered. The letter, she suspected, would need revision. Thoughts of death, inheritance, and disappearance are seldom helpful to correspondence. When she returned that afternoon, Mrs. Denby had allowed her once more into the gallery. There are moments, Miss Marple knew, when some people cannot bear the continuation of ordinary life, and others can bear nothing else. Mrs. Denby belonged perhaps to the latter kind. There was also, Miss Marple thought, a certain comfort to be had from the company of someone who asked questions softly and never dramatised what others were already finding sufficiently difficult. The hall remained closed to the public, and a constable had been stationed at the main entrance. He was a large, placid young man whose chief gift appeared to be the ability to stand for extended periods without resentment. Having admitted Miss Marple on Mrs. Denby's authority, he resumed his position with the calm of one who neither expects excitement nor desires it. The gallery lay empty in the afternoon light. That light entered differently now than it had in the morning. It came low and broad through the western windows, crossing the tiled floor in long flat panels and climbing the opposite wall in a pale diagonal. It revealed what lamplight concealed and what morning clarity sometimes overexposed. The slight unevenness in old stone, the worn edges of shelves, the depth of cracks in aged varnish, the minute shifts in colour between one length of wall and another. Miss Marple had often reflected that illumination does not merely show objects, it alters them. The same was true, she thought, of information. She moved through the room at her usual unhurried pace, pausing where it was natural to pause, looking where it was natural to look, and for that reason seeing a very great deal indeed. Her interest in the collection was genuine. She did not pretend curiosity where she felt none. It simply happened that genuine curiosity, properly applied, was often the most useful thing in the world. She had nearly reached the eastern half of the gallery when she noticed it. A row of decorative bronzes stood upon a low shelf between two substantial portrait frames, small commemorative pieces of the Victorian sort, classically inspired and faintly self-important, depicting allegorical figures in attitudes of moral steadiness or civic resolve. They had been arranged with museum neatness beneath brass labels, their little metallic virtues preserved for modern observation. The frames behind them were large and gilded, containing portraits of Langley ancestors from the mid-18th century, each surrounded by heavy moulding whose lower edge descended close to the shelf. At the lower right corner of one of those bronze-frame displays, caught where the moulding curved inward near the base, there hung a fragment of crimson ribbon. It was quite small, perhaps 2 inches long, no more than half an inch wide. Yet its colour gave it an immediate insistence. It was a rich, deep red, not the cheap brightness of parcel ribbon or household trimming, but the clear, well-dyed red one associates with better clothing accessories. One end had frayed. It did not look cut. It looked torn. Against the subdued gold and brown of the frame it was startlingly conspicuous, though only, Miss Marple reflected, to the sort of person who notices what does not belong. She did not touch it. Instead, she regarded it from where she had first seen it, then from 2 other positions. She noted the height at which it was caught, roughly the level of a person's shoulder or upper arm, if one stood close to the shelf and turned slightly. She observed, too, that the nearest bronze had been shifted, only fractionally, but enough to indicate that someone had brushed past it, not with the deliberate care of a visitor leaning in to read, but with the carelessness or haste of someone whose attention had been elsewhere. Such things, taken separately, meant very little. Taken together, they began to acquire character. Miss Marple straightened, glanced quietly the length of the gallery, and then made her way back toward the curator's office. Mrs. Denby sat at her desk surrounded by insurance forms, her expression carrying the resigned patience of one obliged to perform bureaucratic duties at precisely the moment when bureaucracy feels most offensive. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, and there was in her face that slight reserve which appears in people who suspect a question is coming, and are not entirely sure whether they welcome it. Miss Marple mentioned the ribbon as if it were a minor housekeeping matter. There appeared, she said, to be a small piece of red cloth caught on one of the bronze frames near the eastern end of the gallery, and she wondered whether it might have been there before the previous evening, or whether it was something newer. She phrased it with all the softness of casual observation, the tone of someone who would be equally interested in a missing umbrella or a cracked teacup. It was, she had found, the best possible tone for obtaining truthful answers. Mrs. Denby set down her pen. She said that she had not noticed the ribbon herself. She could not say whether it had been there before the evening tour. The gallery was inspected regularly, certainly, but a small thing of that sort might very easily escape attention. Miss Marple agreed at once that this was entirely possible. Then, with the same conversational lightness, she remarked that only a few people could have been in the gallery after the tour concluded, and asked whether Mrs. Denby could tell her precisely who those people were. Mrs. Denby considered before answering. She herself, she said, had remained in the building for some 20 minutes after the others had begun to leave. Finishing the usual closing procedures, Dr. Wells had stayed on with the side entrance key. Mr. Hale had assisted with securing the display cases and, she believed, had departed at about the same time as the other visitors, though, as she had already said, she had not personally watched him leave. Miss Marple thanked her. Then, with the vague fondness of an elderly visitor recalling some harmless visual detail, she added that Mr. Hale had been very helpful on the tour, and that she particularly remembered his coat. A good dark wool, she thought, of the sort that wore well. She had the impression there had been some red upon it, perhaps at the collar or in the buttonhole, though she might be mistaken. Mrs. Denby looked at her for a brief moment. Then she said with careful exactness that Mr. Hale had been wearing a dark jacket with a small red pocket square the previous evening. Miss Marple smiled and said that, yes, that must be what she had remembered. She left the hall by the main entrance, wished the constable a pleasant good afternoon, and walked down the gravel path toward the gate. The sky above the yews was pale and undecided, one of those dry-looking September greys that never quite promise anything. The air smelled faintly of soil and clipped greenery. At the iron gate she paused. A pocket square torn on a frame corner at shoulder height might easily leave behind exactly such a remnant. There was nothing extraordinary in that. Nor was it proof of anything beyond nearness. But people do not usually tear themselves upon museum frames in empty galleries unless they have reason to be moving too close, too quickly, or with their attention directed towards something more urgent than decorum. She had also heard, through those subtle local channels by which information in villages arranges itself into near certainty, that Mr. Hale had told Inspector Cowell he had left the hall early, before the visitors had departed, once his work was done. It struck her as the kind of statement men make when they are not merely recounting a fact, but establishing one. And Miss Marple, walking back toward the churchyard beneath the lengthening shadows of the elms, reflected that whenever a person is anxious to place themselves clearly at a distance from an event, that it is often worth asking why the distance matters so much to them. Chapter 4. A Conversation by the Garden Fountain. The fountain at the centre of Langley Street, Edmund Square, had not functioned within living memory, or at any rate, not within the living memory of anyone prepared to be pinned down to a date. It stood all the same with an undiminished air of dignity, a broad stone basin, a weathered central figure of uncertain classical identity, and an outstretched arm that had once directed water and now directed nothing whatsoever with serene persistence. English villages are full of such things, objects whose practical purpose has vanished while their social usefulness remains untouched. Around its base were several stone benches worn smooth by generations of waiting, pausing, resting, and discussing matters that were never called gossip by those engaged in them. Miss Marple had found the fountain extremely useful. It offered a pleasant view in several directions, and more importantly, it invited the sort of unhurried conversation that does not flourish so well in shops or tea rooms, where one is always faintly aware of cups, purchases, or the proprietor's eye. On the afternoon after her discovery of the crimson ribbon, she made her way there at 3:30, which was one of the square's most sociable hours. By then the news of Dr. Wells's death had penetrated every layer of village life and acquired the quality common to all truly interesting misfortunes. Everyone wished to discuss it, but no one wished to appear to be doing so. As a result, it was approached by indirection, through weather, errands, vegetables, as church repairs, the quality of a loaf, or some observation about the autumn light. Presently, and with perfect naturalness, the subject would arrive. Miss Marple took her usual bench, settled her cardigan, and produced her knitting. It was by now less a domestic necessity than a social instrument. Few things put other people so completely at ease as the sight of an elderly lady apparently occupied with wool. In the course of the next half hour, several villagers drifted into conversation with her, each in the way of someone who had not meant to stop and then discovered no urgency in continuing. The first was Mrs. Judith Farrow, a broad-faced woman of about 70 whose family had run the ironmonger's shop for 3 generations and who possessed, by natural professional consequence, and an extensive and well-maintained knowledge of her neighbours' domestic arrangements. She was not malicious, merely informed in a practical and energetic way, and Miss Marple liked her for it. Mrs. Farrow sat down beside her and declared at once that it was a very sad business about the Professor. Miss Marple gently corrected this to Doctor, and Mrs. Farrow accepted the distinction without concern. He had been, she said, a very civil sort of visitor, asked sensible questions, did not expect the village to perform for him. She herself had seen him in the shop shortly after his arrival, when he purchased a small torch because the hall, he said, was badly lit in certain places. He had thanked her properly. It was a pity, she added, when people with decent manners and practical habits came to unfortunate ends. Miss Marple agreed that it was indeed. Then, with the easy indirectness that serves inquiry far better than interrogation, she asked whether Mrs. Farrow knew much of the Langley family history. Not the architecture, she added, but the family itself, which she thought often told one more than stone and timber ever could. Mrs. Farrow settled herself more comfortably. It was clearly a topic she considered worth sitting for. The Langley family, she said, had been complicated for as long as anyone remembered. Not scandalous exactly, she would not say that, but complicated in the way old landed families often become when property stays fixed and descendants do not. There had been branches. The branches had not always agreed. Matters had become particularly awkward in the 1880s, when old Sir Edmund Langley died without leaving his affairs in the sort of order that would have spared everyone trouble. There had, it seemed, been a younger branch with some claim to part of the estate, particularly to a valuable southern parcel of farmland. The dispute was resolved in the end, as such matters usually are, through a combination of formal law and informal arrangement. The younger branch disappeared from village life. The land passed to the senior line. Everything became quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. Miss Marple remarked that private arrangements are often the most significant part of public settlements. Mrs. Farrow said with emphasis that this was exactly so. Then, lowering her voice a little, not enough to signal secrecy, but enough to suggest that one had entered more delicate ground, she added that there had always been a general understanding in the village that the Hale family's fortunes were somehow connected to the manner in which the matter had been settled. Gregor Hale's grandfather, Robert Hale, had been the estate caretaker at the time. Not long afterward, he had acquired a small but useful piece of land near the southern boundary, under circumstances no one had ever found entirely transparent. The family had farmed it ever since. The subject had not been openly discussed for years, but Mrs. Farrow observed with satisfaction that did not mean it had been forgotten. Miss Marple said she understood perfectly. Places, she thought aloud, often retained such things not as active memory, but as a kind of residue, a deposit left behind by old tensions. Mrs. Farrow approved of the word residue and said she had always felt exactly that, though she had never put it so neatly. When she'd gone, Miss Marple remained on the bench and allowed the square to continue moving around her. Parcels carried, bicycles wheeled, greetings exchanged, doors opened and shut. 2 further conversations followed, less substantial than the first perhaps, but each contributing its own thread to the growing pattern. The first was with Mr. Thomas Reed, a retired schoolmaster who had lived in the village for 3 decades, and who brought to every subject that mixture of method and hesitation which long experience in education often produces. He had known Dr. Wells slightly through correspondence on local historical records and spoke of him with reserved respect. Not brilliant in any flamboyant sense, Mr. Reed suggested, but exact, dependable, serious about documentation. He then mentioned, almost incidentally, that Dr. Wells had written to him a fortnight earlier saying he had found something of considerable interest in the Langley archive, and asking whether Mr. Reed knew anything about estate caretaker records from the later 19th century. Miss Marple's knitting continued in her hands, though a little more thoughtfully. Mr. Reed had replied that he knew nothing specific. He had heard nothing more from Dr. Wells until the present news. It was a pity, he said, that the man had not lived long enough to share what he had found. Local history, in his opinion, depended far too often on the energy of individual scholars and too little on systematic preservation. When the individual vanished, the knowledge vanished with him. Miss Marple agreed that such loss occurred all too often, but she added that written traces had a way of surviving even when people did not. Mr. Reed hoped that was true. The final conversation of the afternoon came from a less expected source. Miss Marple had risen to leave when a young woman of about 25 approached her and introduced herself as Janet Purvis, the part-time administrative assistant at the hall. She was slight, quick in movement, observant by nature, and possessed that mixture of shyness and alertness one often sees in young women who notice much more than they are given credit for. She had come into the square on an errand for her mother, she said, but seeing Miss Marple had wished to speak. In the brief talk that followed, she provided 2 pieces of information of immediate interest. The first was that she had been at the hall on the afternoon before the evening tour, helping Mrs. Denby prepare things, and had seen Dr. Wells arrive early to consult the documents before the other visitors came. The second was more telling. As she was leaving, she had passed Mr. Hale in the entrance hall. He had been, she said with careful understatement, not quite himself, preoccupied, distracted, and not responsive in his usual manner. She'd greeted him, and he had failed to answer properly. That, she explained, had struck her as unusual, since Mr. Hale was generally among the most reliably pleasant of the volunteers. She had told no one, because she had not thought it important. Miss Marple assured her warmly that she had done quite right to mention it. Small observations, she said, often become important only later, or one never knows at the moment which detail will turn the key in the lock. Janet Purvis seemed relieved by this and took her leave. Miss Marple returned toward Mrs. Howell's house by way of the churchyard lane. The late afternoon sun had slipped briefly through the grey and laid a narrow gold line across the upper stones of the wall. The elms were still. The village, outwardly, was as calm as it had been before Dr. Wells ever set foot in it. Yet calmness, Miss Marple reflected, frequently means one of 2 things. Either there is nothing more to be said, or there is something that no one has yet found the courage to say aloud. Chapter 5. A leather ledger in the curator's office. There are some rooms which over time cease merely to contain a person and begin instead to describe them. The curator's office at Langley Hall was very much such a room. It lay at the rear of the building beyond a short passage, separated from the gallery by a heavy oak door which Mrs. Denby habitually kept shut during visiting hours, and in the 11 years of her stewardship it had acquired the unmistakable character of a room governed by discipline, memory and method. The desk was large, substantial, and arranged with the kind of order that does not come from tidiness alone, but from repeated use shaped by habit. Papers were sorted into natural territories, books stood upon the shelves in a system that was evidently practical rather than decorative, and everything suggested that the room belonged to someone who believed serious work deserved serious surroundings. A single window overlooked the kitchen garden, and on its sill stood a pot of rosemary which Miss Marple had noticed during an earlier visit, and, with private approval, identified as being not merely alive but well tended. Mrs. Denby had sent for her on the morning of the 3rd day after Dr. Wells's death. The request had come in the form of a note delivered through Mrs. Howell, asking whether Miss Marple might find it convenient to call. No reason had been given. Miss Marple found that more suggestive than any reason might have been. She arrived at 10 o'clock, was admitted by Janet Purvis, who received her with the composed efficiency of a young woman determined to meet extraordinary events by performing ordinary duties exceptionally well, and was shown into the office. The ledger was already waiting on the desk. It was a large and heavy book bound in dark brown leather, and its corners worn, its spine rubbed soft by years of handling. A brass clasp had been opened, and the volume lay spread at a point some 2/3 through, marked by a narrow green ribbon. Across the page ran columns of figures in the neat, regular hand of a Victorian clerk. In the margins were annotations in a different ink and at a different angle, plainly added later by another hand. Mrs. Denby took her place behind the desk and invited Miss Marple to sit opposite, with the calm formality of a woman who had considered a matter carefully and decided upon candour. She said that since Miss Marple's visit the previous day, she had been making inquiries regarding the reading table and the missing papers. She had questioned the staff as thoroughly as she could without provoking alarm or resentment, and had satisfied herself that no one under her supervision had removed anything from the table. She had also, she added with characteristic precision, examined her own memory with equal seriousness, and was satisfied that she herself had not done so either. Miss Marple said that she had rather expected as much. Mrs. Denby looked at her steadily. She said that Gregory Hale had served the Hall faithfully throughout her 11 years there, and had, during that time, shown himself dependable, knowledgeable, and in nearly every way admirable. She spoke as a fair-minded person speaks when she wishes it understood that what follows is not gossip, malice, or emotional reaction, but reluctant judgment. Then she said that during the fortnight before Dr. Wells's arrival, she had observed a change in Mr. Hale. At the time, she had dismissed it as some private anxiety of the sort that can afflict anyone without explanation. But since Dr. Wells's death, she had found herself re-evaluating it. Mr. Hale had been less easy than usual in conversation, more deliberate in his movements, and on 2 occasions had lingered near the Eastern document cases after he had no practical reason to remain there. She had thought little of it then. She thought a good deal of it now. Miss Marple said that this was very useful indeed. Mrs. Denby then turned the ledger toward her. The marked entry was dated the 14th of March, 1887. It recorded the transfer of a parcel of land, Southfield and the Lower Meadow, some 40 acres in all, from the estate of the late Sir Edmund Langley to one Robert Hale, identified in the entry as estate caretaker and land steward. The transfer, it said, had been made in consideration of services rendered over a period of 14 years. Miss Marple read the entry once, then again more carefully. After that she examined the marginal annotations. These were less formal, more practical, and unmistakably later additions. They referred to an agreement between the estate's legal representatives and Robert Hale, stated that certain documents relating to the original transfer had been separately filed, and included one phrase that held Miss Marple's attention at once. Arrangement confirmed without reference to the contested correspondence. She read it twice. Then she looked up. Mrs. Denby was watching her, not impatiently, but with the still alertness of someone waiting to see whether another mind had arrived precisely where her own had gone. Miss Marple asked whether the separately filed documents had ever been found. Mrs. Denby said that that was exactly the difficulty. She had known of the ledger for years, having catalogued it herself during an early review of the estate records, but the notation had not struck her then as particularly remarkable. Only when Dr. Wells wrote in advance of his visit, specifically requesting materials connected with the Southfield transfer of 1887, had she returned to it and considered more fully what the contested correspondence might imply. After that, she had searched for the separately filed documents. She had not located them. Miss Marple said gently that she had not supposed she had. There followed one of those pauses in which no words are needed because both minds have already covered the same ground. Mrs. Denby then continued in the careful language of a person unwilling to accuse but no longer willing to ignore. Dr. Wells, she said, had evidently known something of the annotation before arriving. His letter had not named the contested correspondence outright, but had referred to the matter closely enough to suggest prior awareness. He had therefore come not merely to inspect the ledger, but in search of the missing documents which he believed must once have existed somewhere among the Langley papers. Miss Marple asked whether there was any portion of the archive not included in the general catalogue. For the first time in the conversation, Mrs. Denby hesitated. There was, she admitted, a small oak display cabinet on the upper balcony containing older maps, deeds, estate papers, and miscellaneous documents not yet fully catalogued. Proper work on them required specialist attention and money, both of which had been in short supply. The cabinet was locked. The key was kept in the curator's office. Then, after a pause, she added something else. 2 weeks earlier, during a routine check, she had noticed that the cabinet key was missing from its proper place in the office key cupboard. Assuming it had merely been mislaid, she had used the spare and intended eventually to replace the original. At the time, she had attached no significance to the matter. Miss Marple said softly that significance is very rarely visible at the moment one first encounters it. Mrs. Denby gave the faintest response to this. Not quite a smile, and not agreement exactly, but the acknowledgement of someone who knows the truth of a remark too well to answer lightly. Before leaving, Miss Marple asked one more question. Did Gregory Hale ever have occasion, through his work at the Hall, to enter the curator's office or reach the key cupboard? Mrs. Denby replied that formally, no. The office was generally locked when she was absent, and only she and Janet Purvis had their own keys. But she admitted, with complete honesty, that there were times during preparation for visiting hours when the office might briefly be left unlocked and unattended. A person long familiar with the Hall, and Mr. Hale had known it intimately for 11 years, would certainly know where the cupboard was and how the keys were arranged. Miss Marple said that she had rather expected that too. She thanked Mrs. Denby warmly, put on her coat and left by way of the passage and the gallery. In the doorway she paused for a moment and looked down the long stone room. The portraits, the cabinets, the neat ranks of labelled history, and at the eastern end the place where an old matter of land, silence and private arrangement had risen suddenly into the present and produced death. Outside, the kitchen garden gave off the mild scent of herbs and turned soil. Somewhere beyond the wall, a wood pigeon continued its repetitive, contented murmur, undisturbed by inheritance, concealment, or murder. Miss Marple thought there was something to be said for creatures who kept steadily to the point. Human beings seldom did. Chapter 6. A Dispute. Near the Spiral Staircase. In the days after his arrival, Inspector Cowell established himself in the small front parlour of the Langley Arms, the village's only inn. It was not an ideal headquarters, but it was serviceable. He made known through the usual channels that any resident with information might call upon him there, and a number of residents did precisely that, motivated by the usual mixture of public duty and private interest, which sudden death produces in well-ordered communities. Miss Marple was not among them. This was not because she lacked information. It was because she preferred information to have settled into shape before presenting it to someone whose professional habits were, quite understandably, more comfortable with facts once they had become demonstrable. Inspector Cowell struck her as a man who respected evidence that could be placed firmly upon a table. She respected that in him. It merely meant that the table needed to be more fully set. On the 4th morning after Dr. Wells's death, she was engaged in precisely this quiet work of arrangement when Mrs. Howell mentioned over breakfast that she had heard from her neighbour, Mrs. Patricia Unwin, that Mrs. Unwin's daughter, Sophie, had something on her mind, which she felt she ought perhaps to tell the inspector, though she had not yet found the nerve to do so. Miss Marple set down her toast. She asked in a voice so mild that it would have deceived anyone who didn't know her well what sort of something it was. Mrs. Howell explained that Sophie Unwin worked 2 afternoons a week at the Hall helping with small repairs and maintenance, the endless modest tasks that old buildings generate if they wish to remain standing. On the evening of the tour, Sophie had been on the upper balcony carrying out some minor repair work before the visitors arrived. She was, Mrs. Howell added, a sensible girl of about 30 and not at all given to melodrama. She had heard something that had troubled her ever since. Miss Marple asked whether a conversation with Miss Unwin might be possible. Mrs. Howell thought it very likely, since Sophie was coming that afternoon to her mother's house for tea, and Mrs. Unwin was precisely the sort of hospitable woman who considered one more guest at the table less a burden than an opportunity. Mrs. Patricia Unwin's cottage stood beyond the post office, square, neat and solid, with a vegetable garden that suggested both practicality and pride. The kitchen smelled of recent baking and warmth. Mrs. Unwin herself was a direct, capable woman whose instinctive solution to uncertainty was to provide tea and something hot. which Miss Marple had always considered among the more civilized instincts available to mankind. Sophie Unwin resembled her mother in build and colouring, though she was less certain in manner. She received Miss Marple's questions with visible relief, as though she'd been waiting for permission to speak, and was grateful to find that it had come in a form that did not feel official. She explained that on the evening in question, she'd been on the upper balcony, repairing a strip of decorative moulding near the inner rail. It was fiddly work and required concentration, but the position of the balcony above the spiral staircase meant that sounds from below rose very clearly through the stone well of the stair and the adjoining corridor. She had heard voices, 2 voices, both male, coming from the area below, either near the staircase itself or in the corridor beside it. She could not make out every word distinctly, and she was careful not to pretend she could. But the nature of the exchange had not been difficult to interpret. One voice had been controlled, strained, urgent, not loud exactly, but held down with effort, which she found in some ways worse than shouting. Miss Marple said at once that she understood perfectly. A contained voice is often far more revealing than an uncontained one, Sophie continued, encouraged. She'd heard the word papers quite clearly. She believed she had also heard family, though on that point she would not be absolute. The second voice had replied more quietly and more briefly, in a tone she described as firm. Then there had been a pause, perhaps of a minute. After that came the sound of a door and then silence. Miss Marple asked whether Sophie had recognised either voice. Sophie said yes, with a fair degree of confidence, at least in one case. She'd been around the hall long enough to know the voices of the regular staff and volunteers. The one she'd heard most clearly, the urgent, controlled voice, was Mr. Hale's. After saying it, she fell quiet in the manner of someone who has carried a piece of knowledge longer than she wanted to, and has felt its weight increasing by the day. Miss Marple told her very kindly that she had done exactly right to speak of it now, and that there was no need to feel guilty. Honest observations are not accusations. They are simply facts waiting for their place in a larger picture. Sophie said she'd been troubled because Mr. Hale had always seemed a perfectly decent man and had invariably been pleasant to her. Miss Marple replied that decency and difficulty are by no means opposites. In her experience, they are very often found in the same person, sometimes to a tragic effect. She walked back afterward by the longer route skirting the village green, from which one could see the southern wall of the hall rising above its yew boundary. And as she walked, she thought about staircases. The spiral staircase at Langley Hall rose in a narrow curve from the tiled corridor to the upper balcony. According to the museum literature, it dated from the mid-17th century. According to common sense, it was exactly the kind of place where voices would carry, movement would be partly hidden, and a private exchange might be attempted by someone who believed themselves reasonably safe from observation. It stood very near the eastern display case, the reading table, and the bronze frames. That mattered. So did other things. During the tour, Mr. Hale had moved through the gallery with the confidence of a man who knew every object and every line of the room. He had answered visitors' questions easily and with patience. Yet Miss Marple remembered that on 2 occasions he had glanced at Dr. Wells in a particular way, briefly, swiftly, and then away again. It was the sort of glance a person gives when wishing to observe without appearing to do so. At the time, she had placed it among those small neutral details one preserves without assigning meaning. It was not neutral now. Mr. Hale, she thought, had either known or suspected that Dr. Wells was not pursuing a merely academic curiosity. He had understood that the man was looking into something specific, something connected to the Hale family, the Southfield transfer, and perhaps the missing correspondence. Whether that suspicion had arisen only after Wells' arrival or during the preceding fortnight, when Mrs. Denby had noticed his changed manner, was not yet entirely clear. But another question pressed harder. What had he done once his suspicions became certainty? There was also the matter of his account to the inspector. He had apparently stated that he left the hall before the visitors departed, having finished securing the display cases. It was a neat account, clear, complete, and professionally useful. It also had the unmistakable quality of something prepared in advance. Sophie Unwin's testimony placed his voice in the corridor area at a time inconsistent with such an early departure. Mrs. Denby had not seen him leave. Janet Purvis had noticed him in an uncharacteristically preoccupied state the day before the tour, at precisely the sort of time when the missing cabinet key might have been taken. The crimson ribbon suggested he had been near the frame and shelf in haste or agitation. The missing papers had vanished from the reading table after Dr. Wells used them. The oak cabinet upstairs still remained to be considered. None of these things, Miss Marple knew perfectly well, amounted on their own to the kind of evidence Inspector Cowell would find conclusive. But taken together, they formed not a random scattering of detail, but an accumulation. And in her experience, when a number of small facts lean persistently in the same direction, it is generally because something substantial lies at the end of them. By the time she reached Mrs. Howell's gate, she was no longer thinking chiefly about whether Gregory Hale was involved. She was thinking about how much he had already concealed. Inside, Mrs. Howell provided tea made exactly as tea ought to be made, one of her many quiet virtues. Miss Marple sat by the window overlooking the garden, where a late bee persisted in methodical examination of the remaining flowers and allowed her thoughts to go on working. There was still the matter of the upper balcony, and the locked oak cabinet, and what, if anything, remained inside it. Those were not small matters at all. Chapter 7. Lantern glow over the upper balcony. And there are distinct advantages to being an elderly woman of entirely unremarkable appearance in a village preoccupied with serious matters. One of the most practical is that one may move about with very little notice. Miss Marple had recognised this truth many years before and had always regarded it as one of life's quieter compensations. People engaged by dramatic events tend to look for dramatic figures. They overlook the mild, the ordinary, and the elderly with remarkable consistency. She had never found that to her disadvantage. It was with this comfortable reflection in mind that she presented herself at Langley Hall on the morning of the 5th day. The previous evening she'd sent a short note to Mrs. Denby asking whether, if it were not inconvenient, she might spend some time examining the upper gallery before her stay in the village came to its natural close. The reason given was perfectly truthful, though not exhaustive. She had not yet looked at the balcony display cases with any real thoroughness. Mrs. Denby had replied with equal brevity that she would be very welcome. A different constable now stood at the entrance, but he was much like the first, young, placid, and evidently in possession of instructions he had no desire to embellish. He admitted Miss Marple with a nod and returned to his post. The hall was quiet in a way that made one newly aware of how much quiet old buildings can contain. The public rooms remained closed. Their usual life, footsteps, low voices, the mild clatter of visitors pausing, reading, drifting onward, had been suspended, and the building had not yet accustomed itself to the absence. It seemed to Miss Marple that houses and halls grew used to people much as villages did. She passed through the ground-floor gallery at her usual deliberate pace, and began ascending the spiral staircase with due respect for stone steps worn smooth by centuries of feet, less cautious than they ought to have been. The stair rose in a close curve between old walls darkened at intervals by the touch of many hands over many years. Miss Marple noticed those marks as she climbed and found them curiously affecting. There is something moving, she thought, in the accumulated evidence of ordinary human caution. The upper balcony extended the full length of the gallery below. An iron rail ran along its inner edge above the eastern corridor. And beyond the rail the drop opened to the tiled floor beneath. The ironwork was solid, well maintained, and old enough to retain character through many layers of paint. Along the outer wall, between the arched windows, stood display cases holding smaller objects than those downstairs: letters, journals, private accounts, domestic papers, the intimate and miscellaneous remains by which a family is often better known than by its portraits. Miss Marple walked the balcony with genuine interest. She paused before a case of correspondence from the 1840s, reading what she could of the rounded handwriting with the quiet pleasure of someone who has always found the private texture of past lives revealing. Then she continued toward the far end, where the oak cabinet stood between the last two windows. It was a handsome piece, older than the museum cases beside it, with carved panels and brass fittings made in an age when brass fittings were expected to remain useful for generations. A printed notice stated that it contained early estate papers undergoing cataloguing and thanked visitors for their patience. The cabinet was closed. The lock, so far as she could see, was engaged. Miss Marple turned from it and looked back along the balcony. From that position the iron rail ran away in a straight line, and below it the eastern corridor lay fully visible, receiving the daylight in pale oblongs upon its tiled floor. At the far end the opening of the spiral stair was clearly marked by its low stone surround. She moved to the rail and looked down. The drop was not enormous, but it was quite sufficient. A fall from that height onto stone and tile would easily produce grave injury. The rail, though sturdy, was lower than any modern builder would have chosen. For a person of average height, especially in poor light or under emotional strain, its top edge sat low enough that a sudden shift of weight could become dangerous with alarming ease. In a narrow space, one did not require violence on a grand scale. One required only imbalance, whether caused by a stumble, a struggle, a startled movement, or a push that need not even have been very hard. Miss Marple rested her hands lightly on the iron and thought about the evening of the tour. On the balcony floor near the rail she saw scuff marks. They were not dramatic. Old boards collect marks as naturally as old faces do lines, yet these differed slightly from the general wear. Their edges were sharper. They lay at an angle suggestive not of idle walking, but of sudden weight shifted under pressure. Dust had settled over the boards, but the marks cut through it with a relative freshness that distinguished them from the older scuffs around them. A little farther away there was a second disturbance, less pronounced but still there, something that suggested a rapid turn in the confined space and movement away, back toward the staircase. She touched nothing. Instead, she let the physical facts present their own quiet argument. The sequence they suggested was not complete, but it was coherent. There would have been very little light on the balcony at the relevant hour. The evening tour had ended around 8. The upper wall fixtures, Miss Marple remembered, produced an atmosphere suitable for historical contemplation, but not for accuracy of movement. From above, a person in the corridor below would have appeared against the lighter tiles as a shape clearly enough seen, but from below, anyone on the balcony would have been largely obscured by shadow. That too mattered. She turned and walked back toward the stairs at the same unhurried pace, descended carefully and came to a halt in the tiled corridor below. There she stood for a full 2 minutes, looking upward through the stair opening and then along the corridor toward the eastern end of the gallery. It was a confined place. The walls were close, the floor hard and unforgiving, the proportion such that one could imagine voices carrying, footsteps echoing, and sudden events taking on a violence greater than their actual force. Then she walked slowly to the eastern end, there where the corridor opened into the main gallery. The reading table was still bare. The bronze figures stood in their row beneath the frames. She did not look for the crimson ribbon. She had already established its presence, and did not need to confirm again what she already knew. Instead, she studied the height of the lower corner of the frame from the floor, and considered the path a person might take if they came quickly from the staircase, in poor light and considerable agitation. Yes, a man descending rapidly from the balcony after some sudden and disturbing event might very well pass too close to the frame. If his pocket square had already worked loose in the disorder, it might catch at precisely that point and tear away, leaving the remnant she had seen. It was a very small detail, but then Miss Marple had long since observed that nearly everything important begins as a very small detail. It is only when people fail to notice such things that they are later forced to confront them in a much larger and more unpleasant form. She left the gallery and stepped into the kitchen garden, where the morning air felt sharp and clean. The rosemary on the sill of the curator's office shone in the light with a vigorous grey-green certainty entirely free of human complication. The oak cabinet upstairs remained locked. Mrs. Denby had a spare key, and Miss Marple felt that the time had come to ask what that cabinet actually contained. Chapter 8. A dust-covered scroll in the oak display cabinet. Mrs. Denby received the request with the same thoughtful self-command that marked all her more serious decisions. She was not a woman who rushed toward action merely because action was available. She preferred first to satisfy herself that it was justified. Years of responsible guardianship over the hall's contents had shaped her mind into something orderly, careful, and resistant to impulse. Miss Marple admired her for it. Mrs. Denby said that she would be very willing to open the cabinet. She said it in the tone of someone who had already been moving, inwardly, toward the same conclusion, and was quietly relieved to find another mind arriving there independently. She took the spare key from the office cupboard, and together they made their way up the spiral staircase. Mrs. Denby with the ease of long practice, Miss Marple with slower but perfectly competent care, being of the opinion that one ought not to encourage one's joints toward laziness. The balcony was still and pale with morning light. Mrs. Denby walked directly to the cabinet. Miss Marple followed more slowly, pausing once to glance again at the disturbed section of floor near the rail, and once to look down into the corridor below, confirming the impression she had already formed and storing that confirmation away with quiet satisfaction. The brass lock opened smoothly. Mrs. Denby drew back the carved doors. Inside, the cabinet held 3 shelves of unequal depth, the lowest designed to receive rolled papers. On the upper 2 were bundles of folded documents, small bound volumes, and flat portfolios for maps or large sheets that ought not be rolled. The arrangement was provisional rather than formal, grouped with some order, but clearly awaiting the full attentions of cataloguing that had not yet been possible. Mrs. Denby stood back with patient restraint. Miss Marple began to examine the contents with systematic care, taking in first one shelf, then the next, moving from top to bottom without touching anything. It was on the lowest shelf, partly hidden behind a portfolio of estate maps, that she saw it. A scroll, not large, perhaps 18 inches in length, tied with an old strip of faded tape that had long ago surrendered whatever its original colour might have been. Even at a glance it had the unmistakable look of genuine age, not merely something old, but something long undisturbed in a safe environment. Beside it, pushed farther back against the rear panel, lay a small bundle of folded papers tied with what appeared to be the same aged tape. Their edges were darkened in the way active documents become darkened when much handled in their own time and never handled again afterward. Miss Marple said very quietly that she thought those might be what they were looking for. Mrs. Denby looked for a moment, then reached in and removed both items with careful hands. They carried them downstairs to the curator's office, where the broad central space of the desk had been cleared. Morning light from the garden window fell across the surface with this kind of even illumination that makes reading possible and concealment difficult. Mrs. Denby, without being asked, took gloves from a drawer and put them on. The scroll was opened first. It proved to be an estate plan drawn some 10 years before the Southfield transfer recorded in the ledger. Yes, it had been made with professional accuracy. Parcel lines in dark ink, boundary notations carefully entered, each section labelled with its name and measured area. Southfield and the lower meadow were clearly marked in the southeastern part of the estate, their outline and acreage corresponding exactly to the ledger entry. Useful, certainly, but not decisive. It was the bundle of folded papers that mattered. There were 7 documents in all. Mrs. Denby unfolded them one by one, placing them in order across the desk, while Miss Marple read each with concentrated calm. She was grateful, as always, for the clear regularity of Victorian handwriting when it chose to behave itself. The first 3 were letters sent to the estate solicitor by Frederick Langley, a member of the younger branch of the family living in Shropshire. Written over 6 months in the late 1880s, they disputed the transfer of Southfield and the Lower Meadow. Their argument, phrased with the measured firmness of a man who had obtained proper advice, was that these lands had been verbally promised to the younger branch by Sir Edmund before his death, and therefore ought not to have been disposed of as part of the general settlement without reference to that claim. The fourth document was a legal opinion, brief, technical, but significant. It did not guarantee Frederick Langley's success, but it made plain that his position had substance. His claim was not frivolous. It was real enough to be troublesome. The fifth document changed the entire complexion of the matter. It was not addressed to the solicitor, but directly to Frederick Langley. The body of the letter did not identify the writer, but a pencilled note in the margin of the sixth document named the hand as Robert Hales. The letter itself was respectful in tone and poisonous in purpose. It informed Frederick Langley that certain facts had come to the writer's attention regarding his debts, facts which, if more widely known, would cause difficulty for the family's reputation in the county. It then suggested, in language so oblique that it was almost elegant, that the dispute over Southfield and the Lower Meadow might very well be permitted to lapse without further correspondence. No vulgar threat, no explicit blackmail, only pressure delicately applied. The sixth document was Frederick Langley's reply. It was short, rigid, and final. He would not pursue the matter further. The seventh document was the formal transfers deed itself, correctly executed and witnessed, conveying Southfield and the Lower Meadow to Robert Hale in consideration of services rendered. Miss Marple stepped back slightly and looked at the 7 papers laid out in sequence. It was a sensation she knew well, not satisfaction, because there was never much satisfaction in the underlying facts of such discoveries, but a kind of cold completion. The picture had assembled itself at last. Robert Hale, estate caretaker and land steward, had acquired compromising knowledge about Frederick Langley's financial state, and had used that knowledge with exact calculation to silence the one man capable of seriously contesting the land transfer. The deed had been properly executed. The legal surface of the matter had remained intact, and the papers that explained how that surface had been preserved had been hidden away in an upper cabinet and left there for decades, until Dr. Adrian Wells came to Langley Street, Edmund. He had come with advanced knowledge enough to ask the right questions. He had studied the ledger. He had looked for the separately filed documents. He had found, or was on the verge of finding, precisely what Robert Hale's descendant had every reason to fear. Mrs. Denby stood beside the desk, her expression divided between dismay and relief. After a long silence, she said that she supposed this must have been what Dr. Wells knew was there. Miss Marple said that she believed it was. And now, she added gently, it was time to speak to Inspector Cowell. Not because the inspector would at once grasp every moral and historical implication of the documents. Miss Marple had not yet revised her opinion of the limits of his imagination, but because the matter had now become sufficiently demonstrable to engage his strengths. There was at last enough that could be placed before him as fact. Mrs. Denby said that she would telephone the Langley Arms immediately. Miss Marple looked once more at the documents in the clear morning light and thought of Gregory Hale. A man who had lived all his life upon land acquired through an old act of pressure and shame. A man who had likely passed a very uncomfortable fortnight from the moment Dr. Wells' inquiry arrived. A man who had waited day after day for a secret long, buried to rise again into the present and undo the safety of generations. That is not, Miss Marple reflected, a comfortable way to live. Indeed, it had probably never been comfortable. It had only seemed manageable while the truth remained buried and no one came looking for it with knowledge, patience, and a scholar's persistence. Outside the window, the rosemary on the sill remained entirely indifferent to all this, giving off its clean, sharp fragrance and looking exceedingly well. Miss Marple thought that plants had much to recommend them. Chapter 9. A Quiet Talk in the Rector's Study. Inspector Cowell arrived at the hall within the hour. It was, Miss Marple thought, not so much a mark of sudden urgency as of a man who had been waiting several days in a small village with a distinctly uncomfortable awareness that an inquiry existed, without yet having yielded him enough solid ground upon which to stand. There is, she'd often noticed, a particular restlessness in practical men when a matter remained suggestive rather than demonstrable. Inspector Cowell, who liked facts in a form that could be written down, dated and produced again later without alteration, was plainly a man of that type. He came with a constable, and with his usual compact, purposeful air, and he examined the 7 documents on Mrs. Denby's desk with greater slowness than Miss Marple had yet seen him employ. That in itself was revealing. He was a careful reader by habit, but now there was something more, the attention of a man who suspects he is at last looking at the heart of the matter and is determined to make no error in recognising it. He asked questions. Miss Marple answered those which properly fell within her knowledge. Mrs. Denby answered others. Inspector Cowell wrote steadily in his notebook, the pencil moving with that same methodical industry she had observed before, though now with a more evident sense of direction. The questions he put were sensible ones. Miss Marple could not help reflecting that she herself might have wished to ask some of them somewhat earlier in the proceedings, but she checked the thought as unfair. Professional habits form differently in different soil. Inspector Cowell had not, after all, spent a lifetime in parishes and drawing-rooms, studying people who destroyed themselves for reasons they could not have explained even if directly asked. At length, the questions came to an end. There followed a brief pause, the kind that arises when everyone present can see the next necessary step, though no one has yet given it voice. Miss Marple, who had long since learned that official minds are often most receptive when one appears merely to assist their own conclusions, remarked mildly that she had always understood Gregory Hale lived at the old farmhouse on the southern edge of the village, and that the farm, if she was not mistaken, still included the parcel formerly known as Southfield. Inspector Cowell looked at her then with an expression faintly altered from the one he had worn in earlier days. It was the look of a man revising a previous estimate and not finding the process entirely comfortable. He said that he would be calling upon Mr. Hale that afternoon. Miss Marple said she was sure that would be very useful. She left it there. She had business of her own. That same morning she had arranged to call upon the Reverend James Alderton, rector of Langley Street, and Edmund for the past 16 years. She had met him during the first Sunday of her visit and had since formed the opinion that he was one of those clergymen whose value lay not in eloquence, though he had enough of that, nor in doctrine, though he possessed it properly, but in the rare equality of actual pastoral understanding. He was the sort of man who remembered people not because it was his duty to do so, but because he found them genuinely worthy of remembering. She had written asking whether she might call at 2 o'clock. He had replied that she would be very welcome. The rectory stood beside the church in that old and settled companionship in which English churches and rectories have so often existed, each giving the other an air of permanence. The path between them crossed the churchyard beneath yews whose dark stillness seemed older than any recent trouble, and likely to outlast much more. Mr. Alderton admitted her to his study, a room lined with books and warmed by a fire lit against the September coolness. 2 armchairs stood angled toward the hearth in the manner of chairs accustomed to receiving troubled parishioners, hesitant confessions and conversations not meant to be hurried. He offered tea. She accepted. Then he sat opposite her and waited. Miss Marple found that immediately agreeable. There are few qualities more valuable in a listener than the absence of any impulse to interrupt. She told him, in quiet sequence and without intruding upon matters that properly still belonged to the inspector, what had emerged over the past several days. She spoke of the ledger and its annotation, the cabinet documents, the testimony of Janet Purvis and Sophie Unwin, the crimson ribbon, the cleared reading table, the upper balcony, and the corridor below. She described not merely the facts, but the relation between them, the way in which small physical details and human behaviour had begun to point with increasing steadiness toward one conclusion. Mr. Alderton listened throughout without speaking. When she'd finished, He looked into the fire for a little while before answering. His expression was that of a man not surprised exactly, but saddened by the precision with which certain half-felt things had now taken shape. He said that he had known Gregory Hale for all 16 years of his incumbency. He said it with gravity. Long acquaintance imposes honesty. One cannot, when speaking of a man known over years, shelter oneself behind polite generalities without becoming false. He would not, Mr. Alderton said in effect, do Gregory the disservice of praising only the obvious virtues and omitting the tensions that had always lain beneath them. Gregory Hale was, he said, a man who had spent his life in the shadow of something he had not himself done, and yet from which he had benefited completely. Until that day, the Rector had not known the exact historical truth, but he had known, pastorally, instinctively, by the slow accumulation of confidences, silences, evasions and tones, that Gregory's relation to his land and to the village had never been wholly easy. It was not guilt in the strict sense. A man cannot feel literal guilt for an act committed before his birth. Yet there had been something like vigilance in him, a settled inward watchfulness, as if he had long lived with the expectation that some old disturbance might one day rise again, though he could not have said precisely from where. Miss Marple said she had thought something very like it herself. She added that in her experience the people most liable to panic in moments of real danger were not always the naturally wicked. Often they were rather those who had spent years managing some anxious irregularity in their lives, something not openly wrong, perhaps, but not wholly right either, and who, when crisis finally came, found that long habits of concealment and defensive watchfulness translated under pressure into actions they would never previously have imagined themselves capable of. Mr. Alderton said quietly that this was an exact description. He had spoken with Gregory Hale twice since Dr. Wells's death. On both occasions he had been struck not by theatrical sorrow, nor by the strained performance of a man trying to appear suitably affected, but by something deeper and less manageable, the distress of a person who has done something irreversible, and is only gradually understanding the full extent of that irreversibility. At the time, Mr. Alderton had not known enough to speak directly to the cause, so he had done what the pastoral office most often allows when knowledge is incomplete. He had offered presence, steadiness, and the assurance that a room can hold more than people suppose. Miss Marple told him that this had probably been of more use than he knew. Then she said what she had really come to say. Gregory Hale, whom she believed would very much need someone whose judgment he trusted in the hours ahead. Not to interfere with the inspector's work. That was plainly not the rector's role, but to be near him as only a clergyman can sometimes be near another human being at decisive moments. As a reminder that even the gravest events must eventually be understood within a wider perspective than fear allows. Mr. Alderton was silent a moment. Then he said that he had intended to call on Mr. Hale that afternoon in any case, and that he would go at once instead of waiting. He rose with the straightforward purpose of a man relieved to have clarity, where before he had only unease. Miss Marple rose too. She thanked him for the tea and his time. He replied with complete sincerity that the thanks were very much the other way about. Her account, he said, had clarified for him several things he had felt without being able to order. They parted on the rectory path, he turning south toward the lane that led to the old farmhouse, she making her quieter way back through the churchyard. The afternoon had resolved after some indecision into gentleness. The clouds had thinned enough to let the September sun fall in mild, irregular gold. The yews stood dark and permanent. Rooks were beginning their measured occupation of the elm tops along the lane. Miss Marple walked slowly, as she generally did when thought required company rather than interruption. She thought of Gregory Hale, a man probably sitting now in the farmhouse his grandfather had secured by a letter that ought never to have been written. A man waiting with that particular dread which belongs not to uncertainty, but to the knowledge that uncertainty is nearly over. There is, Miss Marple reflected, always a double quality to such endings. One has the satisfaction of understanding at last, but one also has the sorrow that comes from understanding human conduct too well. People do not often arrive at catastrophe by means of one grand wickedness. More usually it is by accumulation, by smaller compromises, private evasions, old advantages accepted and then defended, anxious choices made under pressure, until the distance from decency becomes so great that no one can clearly say when it began. She did not feel any need to say this aloud. Some truths are for walking with, not speaking of, and so she carried them quietly back toward Mrs. Howell's house. Chapter 10. What the gallery still remembered. The news of Gregory Hale's confession reached the village the following morning, which was Friday, with the steady inevitability of news supported by several reliable sources and resisted by none. In villages, facts of genuine importance do not travel noisily. They travel completely. Mrs. Howell learned of it at the post office from Mrs. Farrow, who was receiving a delivery and conveyed the information with the grave relish reserved for events too serious to be called interesting, though they plainly are. She repeated it over breakfast to Miss Marple with proper care, not assuming, though both knew, that such matters deserved to be said precisely. Gregory Hale, it appeared, had spoken to Inspector Cowell fully. This surprised nobody who had spent the last days observing him with any real attention, though it surprised a number of those who had not. Mr. Alderton had been present throughout, exactly as Miss Marple had hoped, and a brief note sent from the rectory to Mrs. Howell's house reported that Gregory Hale had been, in the end, relieved. Miss Marple thought that the right word. Relief is not remorse, though remorse often follows close upon it. Relief belongs to the surrender of something long and privately maintained. It is the release of concealment itself, and only afterward does the moral weight of what has been concealed sometimes arrive in its full force. Miss Marple hoped, quietly, without sentimentality, that in Gregory's case it had done so. The account that emerged through the village's dependable channels confirmed almost exactly what she had already understood. Gregory Hale had seen Dr. Wells' letter of inquiry some weeks earlier, when Mrs. Denby, as was her habit, left correspondence concerning visiting researchers available for the information of the volunteers. The letter specifically mentioned the Southfield transfer of 1887. To anyone else, perhaps, that might have meant little. To Gregory Hale, it meant everything. He had recognised it instantly for what it was, the kind of inquiry he had spent years, perhaps unconsciously decades, fearing. The following afternoon, while preparations for the evening tour were underway, he had used his familiarity with the hall to gain access to the curator's office, take the spare key to the oak cabinet and inspect its contents. He found the documents there. He did not remove them. Miss Marple considered this entirely consistent with his character and position. To remove them altogether would have created a visible absence and invited questions at once. Far better, so he must have told himself, to hope that Dr. Wells had not yet deduced the cabinet's significance, or that, even if he had, he might not discover the key or the documents in time. It was the logic of a frightened man seeking reprieve, not resolution. So Gregory relocked the cabinet, returned the key, and went home to endure the intervening hours in a state of suspense which he could neither calm nor escape. During the evening tour he watched Dr. Wells at the ledger, and understood, with growing certainty, that reprieve was over. When the other visitors departed and Dr. Wells remained, Gregory Hale did not leave the building, though later he tried to place himself outside it. Instead he stayed. He waited. At some point he heard Wells move upstairs to the balcony, where the historian had gone after deducing, as any thorough researcher might, that the annotation in the ledger implied documents not publicly displayed. Gregory followed him up the spiral staircase. He found him at the cabinet which Dr. Wells had evidently opened after locating the key for himself during an earlier opportunity to study the hall's arrangements. That, too, was entirely in keeping with everything known of the man. Dr. Wells had not been careless, vague, or casual. He had been exact. The confrontation on the balcony, Gregory later said, had not been planned. That was likely true. Very little in such scenes is planned beyond the desperate wish that another person will say what one most needs them to say. Gregory asked Dr. Wells, under visible strain, yes, but still controlling himself, to consider the matter privately before publishing anything. Dr. Wells refused. There followed the exchange Sophie Unwin had partly overheard below. Papers, family, an urgent controlled voice, then firm refusal. The balcony was narrow, the light poor, the space around the rail confined. When Gregory reached for the documents, Dr. Wells stepped back to prevent him taking them. In that movement, or the next, balance was lost. Wells struck the rail. It checked him, but not enough. The force of the movement sent him against the stone surround of the stair opening, and from there he fell through and down into the corridor below. Afterward, Gregory descended in a condition he later described as confused and fragmented, unable to recall each separate action with clarity, only the dreadful sequence as a whole. He gathered the fallen documents. He removed the papers from the reading table that Dr. Wells had previously been consulting. He left by the side entrance using the key left there. Then he walked home through the September dark and entered the long interior punishment of the days that followed. Miss Marple read Mr. Alderton's note a second time over a second cup of tea, then folded it neatly and placed it beside her plate. Mrs. Howell, who possessed a fine instinct for the value of silence, said nothing for several minutes. The kitchen remained warm. The old range gave out its steady heat. Beyond the window, the garden held the pale, clear brightness of a September morning that had decided in the night to be fine. The cabinet documents, she understood, had been taken into the appropriate official custody. The estate records would in due course be reviewed, and the matter of Southfield and the Lower Meadow, and of the younger Langley claim extinguished all those decades before by calculated pressure, would work its way through whatever legal and administrative channels remained available. Miss Marple had no wish to direct such matters herself. She had long ago learned that the correction of old wrongs, when it comes at all, comes slowly and imperfectly. Yet imperfect justice through proper channels is still better than the private arrangement that created the injustice in the first place. Near the end of breakfast, Mrs. Howell remarked that Gregory Hale had apparently already spoken of leaving the village. Mrs. Farrow, via a cousin near the lane by the farm, had that piece of intelligence. Miss Marple was not surprised. The legal consequences of Dr. Wells's death would be for the courts to determine, but the village consequences were, in another sense, already decided. One does not remain wholly in a place after disturbing its settled surface in such a fashion. A man may stay physically, but he does not continue there in the same way. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the hall for what she knew would be her last visit before leaving 2 days later. She did not go because anything remained to be solved. She went because she had often found it worthwhile, once urgency had passed, to return quietly to the place where events had unfolded, not from morbidity, from completeness. There are aspects of a place visible only after the excitement has withdrawn and left the room to itself again. Langley Hall had reopened that morning, and 2 visitors were moving through the gallery when she arrived. Mrs. Denby received her with that subdued warmth peculiar to people who have passed through difficulty and now find themselves, if not yet back in ordinary life, at least on the road toward it. She said the gallery felt different, though she could not have said exactly how. Miss Marple replied that she understood entirely. Rooms do not change in any supernatural sense. She had never found ghostly explanations necessary where human ones sufficed, but people carry into them an awareness of what has occurred there, and that awareness alters the room in practice, however impossible it may be to quantify. Mrs. Denby said she had been thinking very much along the same lines. She had reflected since the previous day, and on how much the hall's history had contained without ever fully revealing it. It was sobering, she said, though not wholly discouraging. After all, the documents had not been destroyed. They had been hidden, certainly, but preserved. And in the end, their preservation had served the truth. Miss Marple said that this was a generous and intelligent way to regard it. She then made her way through the gallery one final time, at her usual pace, of course. She took in the portraits, the orderly cases, the eastern corridor with its tiled floor, the iron line of the upper balcony visible above, the reading table beneath the dark portrait of the prosperous Victorian gentleman, whose watch chain and satisfied expression now seemed to summarise a whole class of arrangements made confidently for the inconvenience of others. The bronze frame stood beside the shelf exactly as before, and there, at the lower corner of the rightmost frame, the little piece of crimson ribbon still clung where she had first seen it. Miss Marple looked at it for a moment with mild, comprehensive attention. The attention one gives a detail that has done its part and asks for nothing more. Then she walked on. The afternoon light lay across the floor in pale bars. The portraits gazed from their canvases with the patient equanimity of the long dead, who have no personal investment in the moral distress of the living, and observe all human disorder from a distance beyond embarrassment. At the entrance she paused and looked back once along the full length of the gallery. "Stone walls," she said very softly to no one in particular, "may keep silence for centuries, but they never truly forget." Then she put on her gloves, straightened them with the habitual precision of a woman who had always believed small actions should be completed properly, and went out into the September afternoon. The square lay quiet. The broken fountain remained at its centre in undisturbed patience. The elms along the lane carried their first yellows beneath a mild, clear sky. And Langley Street Edmund continued as such places do, absorbing what has happened, storing it among older layers of memory, and resuming at last the warm, ordinary movement of village life.